Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I never knew that we were poor until I was 12 years old. I thought that we were doing pretty good until I saw how the other side lived. That opened my eyes to, compared to these folk over here, we've got a ways to go here. My grandmother was a civil rights leader. My grandmother actually marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She knew him personally.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Dennis Greene is a former US Air Force officer who shares his incredible journey from a challenging childhood in segregated Savannah, Georgia, to a distinguished military career. He reflects on his early inspirations, the reality of growing up in a segregated South, and the lessons learned throughout his military service. Dennis discusses the significance of teamwork, overcoming adversity, and the pivotal moments that shaped his life, including his experiences in boot camp, nuclear missile training, and the complexities of race within the military. I'm delighted to welcome Dennis Greene to our Cold War conversation. Dennis, welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on here, thanks to Daryl, your son, who apparently is an avid listener of Cold War Conversations.
Yes, he is. And Ian, I didn't know who you were until he described you and your podcast, because he listens at his job with his coworkers, and you're a big hit. You're a big deal here in the U.S. And so it's my pleasure to meet you. And looking forward to spending some time here with you and your audience.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to use that quote. I'm a big deal in the US. That sounds good to me. So let's start with going through your story, because I think it's going to be a really interesting one for the listener. I'm interested to know why you decided to enlist and why you chose the Air Force.
Sure. Good question. I'll even roll it back to when I was just a small child. My mother bought World Book encyclopedias for us because my mother was a teacher. And flowing through it, I saw this thing on Cub Scouts. And it always intrigued me, just being in uniform. But coming from where we came from, we didn't really have the money to do those things. But I was always interested in being in uniform. So my first chance being on a base was I was 12 years old, and there was this program for underprivileged youth at Fort Stewart in Georgia. And there were about 200 of us there. And it turned out that I was named the top camper at 12 years old. And so that was something that always stuck with me. And as time went on, I really needed to get funds to go to college, So after high school in 77, I did go to junior college on a track scholarship, but that wasn't getting me to where I really wanted to go. I always wanted to join the Air Force. And quite honestly, Ian, what really prompted me towards the Air Force was my high school girlfriend at the time's brother and I were really good friends. And he went into the Air Force right after high school in 1977. And he came back with a brand new car and brand new jeans and a brand new shirt. And I was driving an old ruckety car. And I said, I have to make something change now. I have to go. So at age 19, I actually went into the Air Force out of half desperation, half trying to keep my girlfriend and wanting to do something else with my life.
That sounds like a great excuse. So your friend sort of like, he sold it to you. You mentioned that early experience of being on an Air Force base as part of an underprivileged program. What was your family background?
Well, I never knew that we were poor until I was 12 years old, because my mother was a teacher and my father and mother divorced when I was 7 years old. But my father worked at a local sugar refinery, and we lived on the other side of the tracks in Savannah, Georgia. And when I say the other side of the tracks, there are literally railroad tracks separating the east side from the west side. And we lived on the west side, but I never knew that we were poor growing up because we had a window air conditioner in our home and nobody else did. So I thought that we were doing pretty good until I saw how the other side lived. Okay. And so that opened my eyes to, wow, compared to these folk over here, we've got a ways to go here. My grandmother was a civil rights leader. My grandmother actually marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She knew him personally. And so as a child, I would go out with her with marketing materials because the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was Dr. King's organization that he started, I believe, in 1957. And the 8th annual conference was in our hometown of Savannah. And my grandmother was on the committee to bring him there. And so I would hand out leaflets, and she would give me a quarter. And I had no idea the impact of what I was doing at the time. But then the campaign was for poor and underprivileged people. And I asked my grandmother, Grandma, does that mean us too? She said, yeah, I think that kind of means us too. And so that brought it full circle, Ian, to where, the realization of the social construct of how I came up and and some of the hurdles that I had to overcome started to materialize about age 8, 9, and it really came to play in by the time I was 12, when my mother said we saved $1,000, and she was so proud of having saved $1,000. And I knew at that time that $1,000 was good, but that wasn't great wealth. But I understood what it meant to be singled out racially because we were the second family of color into an all-white suburb, and wound up fighting on the school bus and living through a lot of that, but also learning that a lot of those same people came to my defense. And so at a very young age, I learned that, okay, it's not about race or color. They're just good people and they're just bad people. And these bad people happen to look this way, and they don't like, because we started moving up that social ladder, right? We moved out to the suburbs. We got a new car. We got a new home. And just some of the psychological impacts that people go through, I realized it wasn't my fault. And those carry through with me today. And I carry those lessons with me throughout my whole military career.
Yeah. And, segregation would have then still been around when you were growing
Oh,
up in
yes.
Georgia.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, Ian, I drank from colored water fountains as a child. I went to segregated schools until 6th grade. You would have two elementary schools just, less than a mile from each other. One was for whites, one was for blacks. Okay. And it wasn't until halfway through 6th grade that President Nixon ordered the full desegregation now. Okay. For the rest of the South who had not complied with those orders. And for the first time in my life, when I was in 6th grade, I had a Caucasian teacher. And I just remember those days because the parents had problems with it, but the kids didn't. We were just glad, hey, we've got more friends, right? We've got more friends to play with. The kids had no problem with it at all. But I remember the chants, 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate 9, 10, 11, 12. Let the blanks go to hell. Right. And, and,
Wow.
and I just remember that chant. Right. And it wasn't the children. It was just the parents that had issues. And I kind of understood why, but it didn't make any sense. And really today, it still doesn't make much sense of it all. Right. But it was reality. I grew up in that reality at a very young age, and I believe that helped me a lot, particularly through my career as well.
I really appreciate you sharing that. In fact, I've just recently done an interview with somebody who came down in the Mississippi Freedom Summer and was campaigning to get the vote out amongst the black population. And I hadn't realized that I guess I had realized, but like the Democratic Party in the South was actively preventing
Yes.
black people from joining the party or voting.
Right. Yes, the Democratic Party at the time were composed where I live of what was called Dixiecrats. Okay. So they were Democratic segregationists. because Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and most African Americans, most blacks were Republicans up until the signing of the Civil Rights Act, when things tend to flip flop. So, yeah, it was a transitional time in history when I was growing up. And, we can go on and on about it. As a matter of fact, I write a little bit about it in a book that I co authored back in 2020. And so, yeah, brings back memories. And I'm not going to say bad memories, because those lessons learned really stuck with me um, throughout my life and throughout my military career for all 32 years of it.
Did you experience racism during your military career?
You know, um, the answer is yes, but nothing to the degree that I experienced growing up in Savannah, Georgia. It was more of a meritocracy. I found myself drifting towards wherever the opportunities were, the opportunities to get out of those situations. The military provided the best chance and best hope for many of us. I wasn't the only one. There were quite a few others. And it was an escape, and it was a great opportunity. That and sports. Because in sports, you just want the team to win, right? It doesn't matter. And so I found myself gravitating to sports in high school, playing basketball and running track. And I ran track in college before I joined the Air Force. And I, played basketball throughout my military career, played and coached. And so through those two institutions, through the military and through sports, it was more of a meritocracy, right? So, did I experience racism? Sure, I did. I had one supervisor when I was enlisted who just said, he knew my ambition to become a commissioned officer. And talk about a paradox. The guy wrote me the best evaluation that I ever had as an airman. But then he stated, I'll never salute you when you get your commission. Don't expect me to salute you. Okay. And I remember that guy's name, and it stuck with me as to, why would he write me the best evaluation that I ever had, but then paradoxically say, but he would never salute me, if and when I ever got a commission, which I did a few years later, right? And so you experience those things. And so the racism wasn't as outright and overt as it was growing up in the South, but those microaggressions tend to accumulate, and the weight of it becomes another hurdle that you just have to overcome. And there were many of us who did so, and that's one thing that I'm very proud of.
Let's go back to the 24th of May 1979. You've enlisted. You're age 19. Tell me about boot camp.
Boot camp was, to me, a bit of a vacation, because um, it was a vacation because my mother remarried when I was 12. Okay. She divorced when I was 7. She remarried when I was 12. She married a Marine Corps veteran who had 2 Purple Hearts from Vietnam. And he had his leg blown off in combat. That was the second Purple Heart. The first Purple Heart was being shot 5 times and surviving it and demanding to go back to his unit, which they reluctantly let him go back. And he was on the back of a deuce and a quarter during that second go around and hit a landmine that blew him and blew his leg off. And it pretty much could have been the end of him were it not for someone who held his leg together and got him shipped back to the States. And miraculously, after 2 years in a body cast, he came out of it, and he lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And once he got himself back together, he decided to complete his education at Savannah State University, where I lived and my mother lived. And that's where he met my mother. He was a student on the GI Bill, and my mother was a teacher raising us as children, and she married him. And so I was reared by a leg half blown off, pretty much shell shocked stepfather who didn't take any gruff or no back talk, no nothing, right? So living and growing up with him, and he was a bricklayer, and I mixed the mortar for him on the hot summer days in Savannah. It didn't matter. We got up at 5 a.m. in the morning, and he would literally drag me out of the bed by my ankles. Get up, boy, let's go to work. And so I was under that construct up until the time I went to boot camp. So by the time I went to boot camp, to answer your question, it was like a vacation for me. Okay. Having survived that. Now, boot camp itself, I did learn some things. I learned that you can't make it by yourself. And they set up the construct. If I took anything out of boot camp, from the time from Reveille at 4:30 in the morning, you have 10 minutes to get yourself dressed, get that bed made to where you can bounce a quarter off of it and be in formation in 10 minutes downstairs. How do you do that? You can't do it by yourself. And the first couple of times they let you fail. Okay. And then they scream and yell at you about how slow you are and about how backwards you are, and you must be from Georgia because nobody from California would act like this, or blah 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 blah, and they just rail you. But the whole thing is, you realize, oh, if my buddy next to me helps me make my bed and I help him make his, we can get it done 5 times faster than trying to do it myself, right? And so that's the lesson that's kind of pounded into you, that you can't make it alone. You have to work as a team. And my 6 weeks of boot camp, that's the one thing that I took out of it, that wow, you know, you always cognitively know it, but until you live it, you know, it's a different experience. So yes, that's what I got out of boot camp.
Yeah, I've never heard it called a vacation before, so that's the first tennis there. And I guess you're fit because you're doing physical work with your stepdad with the bricklaying
Yes.
and stuff like that. So you the physical fitness isn't an issue for you.
No, and I was an athlete in high school and in college. So and my coaches were 10 times harder on me than the drill sergeants, because the drill sergeants could only legally do so much. Those coaches back in those days, they just say, let's just say that they took liberties that would get them in prison today. But that's just the way it was. You know, I had one coach that they called it the Board of Education, meaning if you screwed up, they would take the board off the wall and whack you.
Wow. Wow.
And so those were the coaches that I grew up with in high school athletics, right? You know,
Yeah.
you didn't want to go to the Board of Education, okay? You didn't want to have that happen to you. So boot camp was yelling and screaming. That was something that happened to me in the street every day. So that was no big deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's, for
Wow.
me, it was a bit of a vacation. And Ian, they actually paid me in the military. Can you believe that? You know, $419 a month is what I signed up for, because I wasn't getting paid, working for my dad, for my
Yeah.
stepdad. Okay. So they actually paid me $419 a month. That was like gold to me back in 1979.
While you're doing boot camp, are they assessing you for what role they're going to put you into? The Air Force?
I came in under a general administrative provision, meaning my whole thing for coming in was to be able to go to school at night. And I told the recruiter, I just need a job to where I'm not going to be working nights, weekends, or anything, so that I can continue my education. And he said, but look, you're so highly qualified in all these highly technical areas. I said, yeah, but those are the areas that's going to get me, working swing shift nights and everything else too. Put me into a general area to where I'm going to pretty much be working days so I can go to school at night. So even though administration was my lowest ranked area on the ASVAB, on the test, that's what I signed up for, general administration. So that's how I got placed into the military. And it just happened to be that when I went to technical training, I was able to bypass the typing part because I took typing in high school. I could type at that point 60 plus words a minute on a manual typewriter. And so that part was pretty easy for me. And so that's how I wound up working in an orderly room during my 2 enlisted assignments.
So this is Myrtle Beach Air Force Base, South
Yes.
Carolina.
Right.
And you're there from 79 to 83. And so right from the off, you want to be an officer. So this is what you're working towards with these classes at night.
Yes, I knew I wanted to be an officer the second day I was in boot camp, when I realized that there was a huge difference. And after the second day in boot camp, and honestly, towards the end, the drill sergeant, he pulled me aside. He says, look, I'm going to tell you something. He says, you need to be an officer. He says, here at Lackland Air Force Base, right down the street is Squadron Officer School. You need to make it a goal to go through that school, not just this school. And so that seed was planted into me, right from the very beginning. So I knew my destiny was to become an officer within the Air Force. That was my one and only goal.
You sort of work your way through while you're at Myrtle Beach. You do work your way up, and you end up being an E5, which I think is a staff sergeant. Is that correct?
Right. And
so that's an NCO then, a non-commissioned officer.
Right. And, becoming a staff sergeant in 3 years starting from E1 was a pretty big accomplishment, which means I was promoted to E4 early after only 18 months based on merit. So after being promoted to E4 after 18 months, my cycle for E5 came up and I was able to pass. And I passed it in by 1/3 of a point, by 0.3. But I barely made it across the line, but that's okay because I had to score high on the testing part because the time in grade and time in service had not built up to the point to where I got those free points. I had to do it all on testing and all on merit. So I made E5. I made staff sergeant in 3 years. And when I left Myrtle Beach for George Air Force Base, I was actually put into an E7 position as a brand new E5 because the squadron commander I had at Myrtle Beach, one of my first squadron commanders, as a lieutenant colonel, made full colonel and went to George Air Force Base as the deputy commander for maintenance. So when I got orders to George Air Force Base, the first thing I did was call up my old commander, Victor Viscara, and I said, Colonel Viscara, I'm coming. He says, you're coming to work for me and you're going to run my most challenging orderly room that I've got. And so it would normally go to a master sergeant who had at least 12 to 14 years in service. I was a brand new staff sergeant with just over 3 going on 4 years of service. And so that was a huge challenge, but I appreciated his faith in me and it helped me grow a great deal and it helped prepare me for what was coming next.
And can you explain what an orderly room is? So what your role entails?
Yes. An orderly room is a place where, if you remember MASH, right? Everybody remembers MASH, the old television series, right? And, Radar was the administrative guy. Radar was quote unquote the orderly room for MASH, right? He was the guy that the commander went to for all the paperwork stuff, right? So I was so the orderly room is the place where all the paperwork stuff happens for a command under a commander. We make the commander look good. We keep everything up to speed as far as performance reports and decorations and any administrative thing that comes through. That's the responsibility of a commander. We handle in the orderly room.
Thanks for that, Dennis. So while you're at George Air Force Base, you get accepted into the Air Force ROTC. Now, I know OTC is presumably Officer Training Corps. What's the R stand for?
Okay. Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, is where you go back on campus to a university, and when you finish your degree, you get commissioned into the military under a certain branch. And there's Army, Navy, and Air Force ROTC. So I went to a Air Force ROTC detachment. At the time was Baptist College, now Charleston Southern University in Charleston, South Carolina, which took me back close to my roots because, of course, Savannah is a sister city to Charleston. And, of course, as I said earlier, my stepfather was from Charleston, so I had family there as well. And so I was accepted into the 2-year ROTC program, which no longer exists anymore. They don't have 2-year programs anymore, but at the time they did at Charleston Southern.
And is that mainly an academic education you're getting there, or is there more to it? Is there more practical stuff there?
Yes, it's the same academic education that any college student would get. So you are a regular college student, but by the way, on top of it, you are also in ROTC, meaning you have to be in uniform a couple days a week, and you have to go to ROTC drills, and you have to go to ROTC leadership labs. And so you have to do all of the military things on top of being a college student all at once.
So did that sort of restrict your partying options then?
Yes, it did. As in the fact, there wasn't much time for partying because pretty much I had two jobs while I was in college ROTC there at Det 772 at Charleston Southern. Um, I'm one of the few people, I may be the only person in the United States of America who started careers as a E1, as an O1, as an officer, but also as a GS1 in the civil service because one of my part-time jobs during ROTC was at the Naval Engineering Systems Command as a GS1, which was a student program they had to augment whatever they needed help with out there in the field. And so I worked at Naval X Charleston and I started as a GS1 while I was an ROTC cadet and a knight and a student at Baptist College at the time, going through college ROTC for those 2 years.
Wow. You must have scarcely had time to breathe trying to juggle all of that.
Pretty challenging and, pretty much the same kind of demands as if you were at an academy. If you were at one of the academies, pretty much the same.
So, Dennis, tell me about the graduation.
Yes. So after 2 good long years of, getting very little sleep and, going through all of that, the day finally comes to where it all pays off, right? And so I wasn't surprised, but I was very proud to learn that I was one of 3 distinguished graduates of about 50 cadets out of my graduating class. And I have to say that I did sort of prepare for it because when I got there in 1984, one of the first things, having been an administrative person, knowing what books to check, the first thing I asked the admin guy was, what does it take to become a distinguished graduate? What are the prerequisites? And I focused on those things to make sure that I did as best as I could in those 5 areas, in the ones that counted the most. And so suffice it to say, there were quite a few of my classmates who were surprised because they thought that getting the highest academic grades, was the real key to it, right? Well, no, it was a fivefold process, and I made sure I maximized each area to the highest degree. And the actual academic grades overall was the least of the 5 areas. When it came to grades, your grades in the ROTC leadership labs counted more than your overall GPA. So I made sure I maxed that out. And my overall GPA was good, but I made sure I made straight A's in leadership. So yeah, so that was an honor. And that's the only thing that carries over from when you're a cadet to active duty is the fact that you graduated as a distinguished graduate.
Right. I think you've shown that it pays to do the research beforehand.
Yes.
Where is your first posting as a newly minted second lieutenant?
Yes. What a story. How did I wind up in Rapid City, South Dakota? It was the last place I wanted to be. Okay. Before you get commissioned, you fill out this thing. It's called the dream sheet, right? And so you get to dream where you want to be. And everybody knew the last thing that you wanted to do was to be in Strategic Air Command, SAC. It was the most rigid, the most hard. The bases were way up north, nothing but snow and cold. And everybody wants to be in Florida, or they want to be in California or Arizona, maybe even Texas if you have that kind of, cowboy flavor or something like that, or abroad. And so I put all these Florida bases and all these cool places. And then I put some abroad. And my number one was Mildenhall. I wanted to come out to where you guys are right now. That was my number one overseas place to go, right? Because I'd heard so much good about that. And lo and behold, the day comes when we get our assignments and we're like puppies panting, right? Our eyes are big. Everyone is wondering. And the professor of aerospace studies, the commander is passing out, here's your assignment, here's your assignment, here's your assignment, here's your, and I look and I saw Ellsworth Air Force Base and I was almost in tears. It was like the one thing I had nothing. Everybody else got something even close to what they wanted. I got nothing to what I wanted. And Ian, I'm here to tell you, this is one of the other lessons. Sometimes blessings come when you least expect it, when you think it's the most horrible, because that was one of the best blessings that I ever received, was to be able to go to Ellsworth Air Force Base during that time and to be able to get the job that I got, because I was supposed to go as a personnel officer. So disappointment with number one was I'm being sent to somewhere in South Dakota where it does nothing but snow all the time. Okay. And then the next disappointment was when I get to the base, I'm supposed to be a personnel officer because one of my mentors was a personnel officer. And he says, Dennis, you know, you got the background. We're going to get you into personnel. And they did. And when I got there, they said, you know, we don't need you as a personnel officer. We have too many personnel officers here. We're going to send you to recreation. So I didn't sign up to be a recreation officer, but at the time, that was one of the places where they could slide you because it was somewhat similar as far as the Air Force codes went, as far as the job codes went. And so off I was shoved into morale, welfare, and recreation as the operations officer for MWR at Ellsworth Air Force Base. And I had no idea, other than scratching my head, how did I wind up here, that it was going to be one of the biggest blessings, because pretty much running non-appropriated funds are any self-generating funds outside of those appropriated by Congress. And there's lots of activities on the base that generate money. The open messes, the child care center, the bowling center, where we sold liquor, and we'll get to that when we get to the Soviet talk about the liquor store, and the place where you rent boats and RVs and all those things, and also the fitness center, the gyms, and the child care centers and the youth centers. They all generated income, and I was in charge of operations of all that revenue being generated, which fit perfectly into my business management background from the degree that I just gotten. And I learned so much about how the base runs. And I learned so much about being out there in the community, because having that type of a job, we interact with the community at large. And so I joined the Chamber of Commerce, and I was, you know, highly recognized as someone really important for the first time in my life, right? And what did I do? But it was really a blessing for those 18 months. And as it turned out, my boss got fired. And as a second lieutenant, I became chief of MWR as a second lieutenant, which was a pretty big
Wow.
deal.
So
And
I was going to ask you, what was the overall budget then that you were working with a year?
at that time, we were generating around $5 to $6 million a year on that base.
Wow.
which was for 1986 was not particularly in the middle of South Dakota. The base, we had about maybe 3,000-4,000 people on that base. So to generate those type revenues and to be in charge of how they were spent, in addition to managing the appropriations that we got to keep our facilities and keep our to keep things going, that was a blessing, right? So getting to Ellsworth, I thought was terrible. And then being sent to be a recreation officer, am I going to pass out baseballs and basketballs to people? Is that what you signed me up to do? I didn't.
Yeah, that's what that sounds like. But, you're the guy with all the money.
But I'm the guy with all the money, and the guy with the big office, and the guy with secretaries, and the guy with this stuff going on. And so it befuddled my friends as to why I would volunteer for a missile tour right there on that same base. And we can get to that, I guess.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because within 2 years of you being the guy in charge of all the cash with that big budget, you volunteer for a Minuteman II strategic missile crew tour.
Yes.
Why'd you do that?
Because for the moment I'd lost my mind. No, that's what my friends would say. They said, no, we're trying to get out. We want your job. You're trying to come here. Have you lost your mind? But I looked at it strategically, Ian. And, when you look at the background, how do you spend 32 years in uniform and never get stationed overseas, right? How does that happen? Well, it happens because I was supposed to go overseas. But when my boss got fired from MWR and I was made chief, I was supposed to go to Spangdahlem, Germany. Every time I had orders to go abroad, something would happen to make me stay. And then I saw that, there's not much of a opportunity past, a certain level in MWR. I have to get to where the action is if I'm going to make this a career. And so the easiest thing to do was just to go to the missile wing commander and say, I want to volunteer. And if you would have seen their eyes to see someone come in highly, who they would consider a pretty good prospect to say, I want to come do this, I would say the percentage of volunteers was less than 5% of all the missileers. Okay. And those are the 5% who got ROTC scholarships for missiles. And so I didn't even get a scholarship for missiles, right? I just said, I want to do it because I think it's something that I need to do right now for my career. And so they said, send this man off right now. Don't let him think twice. Don't let him go to sleep. Don't let him
Yeah, just sign here quickly.
just sign here quickly, right? Sign the dotted line here quickly and get out of here and go. So that's what happened.
And what are you signing up for there? Because you are an officer.
Yes.
So are you part of a two-man crew in a silo, or what have you signed up for there?
Okay, let's take a step back. I signed up for a 4-year career broadening tour. Okay. So I said, I can broaden my career by doing this for 4 years. And it's just 4 years of my life. So I can survive 4 years. I can survive 4 years even here in all this snow and all this cold, right?
And are you married at this point,
Yes.
Dennis?
As a matter of fact, I was married when I was enlisted.
Okay. So was this the same girlfriend from high school?
No,
not?
it was not.
Oh,
No.
okay.
Yeah, things change a lot when you get in uniform. So no, it's not the
You
same.
become suddenly more attractive. Is that what it was?
Yes, exactly. And so no, I'm married at the time, and my son Daryl is born during that first tour at Ellsworth Air Force Base. The one who referred me to you was born in 1988 there on that same base. So I signed up for 4 years of career broadening to be a missile launch officer. Okay, there at Ellsworth Air Force Base. So while I'm in school, and this is another lesson that I learned, the worst chewing out I got as an officer was in that interim prior to going to missile training at Vandenberg Air Force Base, because you have to apply for a enhanced top secret PSYOP ESI type security clearance. And Lieutenant Greene just said, I'll get around to it when I get around to it. Got more important things, got this, that, and the other to do. Well, before I went to school, I had not done the paperwork to apply for that clearance. And so now I was behind, and they were going to have to put me into another class. They said, no, we're not. We're just going to send you back to MWR and you're going to live the rest of your life there as punishment for not doing what we told you to do. And the worst chewing out I ever got was from a bunch of field grade officers who lit me up day and night for not having done it. And I was wrong. And I learned that, wow, okay, this is a big deal, right? It's not just something to play with. It's, I messed up. And they let me know that I messed up. But then I learned about grace too, because then they did give me grace. They said, look, we're going to still send you to school, but if your clearance doesn't come through, we're going to have to send you home. All right. And so it's not going to be on us. And it just happened to be that personnel officer who was my mentor had been shipped off from Myrtle Beach to the Pentagon, working, guess where? In the security clearance office. So this is how God,
Serendipity.
there's serendipity. This is how God works. I call my buddy up. Hey, Tommy, I need my clearance. They're getting ready to boot me out of missile school. He says, we'll get it done. And the people at missile school at Vandenberg were like mystified. Who do you know? How did you? They said, this has never happened before. A clearance has never come through so fast before. So just a little bit of serendipity there, but yes, true. Lesson learned. And yes, moving on
Yeah.
from there.
And that background check is to check your political affiliations. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? All of that sort of stuff, I guess.
Exactly. Yes. Right. And they do a thorough background check on you. I mean, they go back and they interview your middle school teachers, right, to see if you had any, communist type tendencies back then, right? They talk to neighbors who you grew up with. They knock on their doors and do you remember this guy? And they show you, here's a picture of this guy. Do you know who this is? Yes, that's, so and so. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of creepy, but it's necessary.
What's the training like for that? You're having that missile training at Vandenberg. So you're in California, so you're back in the sunshine, and it's the summer of '88.
Yes, summer of '88. And missile school for me, it was pretty tough, I have to say, because it was the first time I had to really engage my brain. I mean, in high school, I had some trigonometry and a little bit of pre-calculus, right? But missile school for me was a little tough because now you're here around a lot of other smart people, you know. I mean, people who are really, really talented, really, really smart, even though they don't quite want to be there, they're there for a reason. They're there because someone realized that they had the potential. And the Air Force does a pretty good job of screening, who gets nuclear duty and who doesn't, much like the Navy. It's pretty tough to get into nuclear duty. And so I was among people who had finished at the top of their classes, Mensa experts, mental, high IQs. And I wasn't out of my league, but I was really challenged, really for the first time academically in my life going through. And so it was tough for me. And I'll never forget, Ian, one of the life lessons that I learned, and I mean one of the permanent life lessons that I carry with me today was in training, you're going through these maneuvers, right? They have this simulated launch control center. And so you're in this simulation and you're going through all the motions and you're going through the checklist, right? And a gentleman who was my trainer, who became my friend later, Darge Dargenio, I was a lieutenant, he was a captain, and he stopped. He said, just stop. And so we stopped everything. And then he pulled me out and he says, look, I got to tell you something. He says, you've got all the talent in the world, you know. He says, but you are afraid to succeed. I said, what? He says, you are afraid to succeed. He says, you're like a mechanical machine. He says, just loosen up and be who you are. He says, but right now, you are afraid to succeed. And wow, Ian, that stuck with me. I was never told that I was afraid to succeed. I was told I was afraid to fail, but I was never told I was afraid to succeed. And from that point on, I looked at life differently. And later in life, and this is another one of these things that you just can't make up. When I'm in Air Command and Staff College and I'm promoted quickly through the ranks, I catch up with my friend Darge Dargenio, and we are in Air Command and Staff College together, not only in the same class, but in the same classroom for a whole year. So,
wow.
Yes.
Wow. And what was that? Were you just nervous that you were going to mess something up?
Yes, because, they tell you these are nuclear weapons. There is no room for any error. You must be 100% perfect all the time. There's no room for any error whatsoever. And so I was stiff, you know, and here I was, an athlete who had competed, but here I was for the first time freezing up, you know. I was, as we say in sports, I was choking. And he pulled me out. He said, "Stop. You are afraid to succeed. You're afraid to win." And that changed my life. That changed my life perspective.
You're giving me some great insights here into the pressures that go on in the military. Do you remember the first time you actually stepped into one of these silos and you're in the seat with
Oh,
the
absolutely.
seat belt and what have you?
Oh, absolutely. I go back to Ellsworth because that's where I volunteered, right? So, they said sign this man up and bring him back. So after the summer of '88, I go into the silo, and I fall victim to what everyone falls victim to on their first alert. They play pranks on you. They play the biggest pranks on you, right? And the prank that was played on me, I subsequently played on many others who came after me. But you're down there in the launch control center, and you're a deputy, and you're with a crew commander, and you're the Greene deputy. Um, no pun intended. My name was Greene, but I was Greene. And they said, "Lieutenant Greene, there's a phone call for you. I took a message here. Call Colonel Sanders at this number." You know, they probably just they probably just want to
Yeah,
welcome you, right? So you call
yeah,
Colonel Sanders, and it's Kentucky Fried Chicken.
yeah. I saw that coming. My
Yes.
surname is Sanders,
Oh, is it? Yes.
and endless things
Endless.
at school around fried chicken. So yeah,
So
no,
yes,
I feel for you there, but it's a good trick to play on you there.
it's and everybody gets it on their first flight. Everybody gets it. They get something. So I got the Colonel Sanders trick played on me, and I used that one on many other newbies coming in after me. Right. That and a few other ones that may not be so appropriate for your podcast.
Oh well, we may have to speak about those offline.
Right.
Um, you're actually in a silo ready to
Yes.
launch with a crew commander.
Yes.
While you're there, I mean, you know if something is a test alert or not
Well, you don't
until
know.
later.
You don't know until after the test is over.
So you
So,
actually think you're going to launch then?
well, yes, up until they tell you that it's a test.
Gee,
And
wow.
so and so you don't know, that's the whole point of being ready, right? Is you will get a something that comes over the communication, and there's different types of ways to communicate. It could be voice, or it could be, in something that's encrypted, or, you know, without getting into deep classified information on how we receive it. There are different ways we can receive it, but when we receive it in that moment, we don't know that it's a test until after we go through whatever the instructions have us do. And then this is the test, cease and desist. And then you go back to sleep or whatever you were
So
doing.
does it go as far as you putting the keys in and then they say
No,
it's a test, or
no, it
not
does
that
not go
far?
that far. No, because the keys are locked. The keys are actually locked up in a container, and is two-person control. And the other person never shall know the combination of the lock of the other person. And so both people have to authenticate that test message. And so when it comes to the authentication piece of the message, that's when you find out that it's a test.
Right.
Because because it tells you do not authenticate, you know, this is a test.
That must be a heart thumping moment up until the time they tell you it's a test. I mean, the adrenaline must be flowing at that point.
Well, no, the adrenaline is not flowing in because it happens so often, it just becomes commonplace, right? It just becomes commonplace, and you expect it to be, except until Desert Shield and Desert Storm, when we thought that Saddam Hussein may have had nuclear weapons. And that's when it got serious. because we didn't know if he had them, and if Saddam Hussein did have them, would he use them, knowing at that time in history, he used every weapon that he had in his arsenal. So the question one, does Saddam have nukes? And two, if he's got a nuke, will he use it? And so during those classified pre-departure briefings, when those tests came through, you could not hear a pin drop, because that's when it was gut-wrenching, because this could be for real. And so we among ourselves sort of rationalize, okay, if this were to be real, it would probably be a Navy nuclear sub that would retaliate. However, we were still, those were tense moments. Okay. But then outside of that, once that faded, and then, we kind of went into deactivation mode after that time. But yeah, that was a time to where we really couldn't hear a pin drop.
And I guess with the Soviets, did you think they're never going to be crazy enough to launch an attack? So the chances are we're never going to get a real.
No, we did we ever think? Good question, Ian.
I'm sorry. That's it for this week. But if you want to hear more of Dennis's story, the next episode will be out on the 25th of October. The episode extras, such as videos, photos, and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.